The shadow that fell across Adelaide Graham's path on that September evening in 1878 was not the first, but it was the one that made her heart hammer with true fear. Adelaide had noticed the trapper 3 weeks prior, his eyes following her as she finished her shift at the Montana City General Store. The mountain settlement tucked into the wilderness of Montana Territory had seemed safe enough when she had arrived 6 months ago, fleeing memories of her father's debts and her mother's early grave back in St. Louis. At 22, she had thought herself capable of building a new life in this rough frontier town, working honest hours for honest pay. But the trapper, a wiry man with tobacco-stained teeth and hands that seemed too quick, too eager, had shattered that fragile sense of security. She quickened her pace now, her worn boots clicking against the wooden boardwalk as the sun dipped behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and rust. The trapper kept his distance, perhaps 50 yards back, but she could hear his footsteps echoing hers, matching her rhythm like some terrible dance. Her boarding house stood another quarter-mile ahead, and the spaces between buildings grew wider here, the protection of civilization thinning with each step. Adelaide's fingers tightened around the fabric of her shawl. She had tried everything. She had mentioned the man's behavior to Sheriff Dawson, who had merely shrugged and said he could not arrest a man for walking the same streets. She had varied her route home, but the trapper always seemed to find her. She had even asked Mr. Peterson, the store owner, if she might stay later until the streets filled with evening traffic, but he needed to return to his own family and could not wait. The sound of boots behind her grew louder, closer. Adelaide's breath caught in her throat. Then, from the alley between the smithy and the feed store, another figure emerged. This man was nothing like the trapper. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they seemed to block out the fading light. Dark hair fell past his collar, slightly unkempt, and a thick beard covered a strong jaw. But it was his eyes that stopped Adelaide's panic for just a moment, eyes the color of storm clouds that assessed her situation in a single sweeping glance. He wore buckskin and fur, the clothes of a man who lived more with nature than civilization, and his arms, visible beneath rolled sleeves despite the cooling evening air, were corded with muscle that spoke of a life of hard physical labor. The mountain man stepped directly into Adelaide's path, and she stumbled backward with a small gasp. He removed his wide-brimmed hat, revealing more of a face that was handsome despite its roughness, weathered by wind and sun. "Evening, miss," he said, his voice a deep rumble that somehow felt safer than it should. "I am Tobias Kane. I have been watching that situation developing behind you for the past 3 blocks, and I find myself unable to walk on without offering assistance." Adelaide glanced over her shoulder. The trapper had stopped, standing beneath a post that supported an overhang, pretending to examine something in the window of the closed tailor shop. "I do not wish to be trouble," Adelaide whispered, though relief flooded through her. "No trouble at all," Tobias said. He offered his arm, a gesture so formal it seemed almost out of place from a man who looked like he wrestled bears for entertainment. "Might I walk you to your destination? I was heading that direction myself." It was certainly a lie, but Adelaide accepted it gratefully. Her hand trembled slightly as she placed it in the crook of his elbow, and she felt the solid strength of him beneath her fingers. They began walking together, and Adelaide risked another glance backward. The trapper remained where he stood, his expression dark with something between anger and calculation. "I am Adelaide Graham," she said quietly. "I work at the general store." "I know," Tobias replied, then seemed to realize how that sounded. "That is to say, I have seen you there. I come into town for supplies every few weeks. Last time, You helped me find lamp oil and coffee beans." Adelaide remembered now. He had been polite, soft-spoken despite his imposing size, and had paid in coins so worn they seemed ancient. She had not thought much of it then. Just another mountain man coming down from whatever isolated cabin he called home. "How long has that fellow been following you?" Tobias asked, his voice carefully neutral but his eyes sharp with concern. 3 weeks, perhaps longer." "I cannot be certain when it started, only when I first noticed." Adelaide's voice broke slightly. "I reported it to the sheriff, but he said there was nothing to be done unless the man actually did something, and I suppose walking the same direction is not a crime." Tobias's jaw tightened beneath his beard. "Where do you board?" "Mrs. Coulter's house, just past the church." They walked in silence for a moment, and Adelaide became aware of the curious glances from the few people still on the streets. A proper young woman did not walk arm in arm with a mountain man, especially one who looked as wild as Tobias Kane. But Adelaide found she did not care about propriety just then. She cared about the solid presence beside her, about the way the trapper's footsteps had faded completely, about the first full breath she had taken in weeks. Mrs. Coulter's boarding house came into view, a neat 2-story structure painted white with green shutters. Adelaide slowed as they approached the front gate. "Thank you, Mr. Kane," she said, reluctant to release his arm but knowing she must. "I am grateful for your kindness." Tobias looked down at her, and something in his expression made Adelaide's heart skip for reasons entirely different from fear. "What time do you finish work tomorrow, Miss Graham?" 6 o'clock. "I will be there at 6 o'clock, he said simply, "to walk you home." Adelaide opened her mouth to protest, to say she could not possibly impose, but the words would not come. Instead, she heard herself say, "That would be very welcome, Mr. Kane." He smiled then, a small curve of his lips barely visible beneath his beard, but it transformed his entire face. "Tobias, please. Mr. Kane was my father. Then you must call me Adelaide." He nodded, replaced his hat, and waited at the gate until she had climbed the porch steps and entered the house. Through the lace curtains of the parlor window, Adelaide watched him turn and walk back the way they had come, his long strides eating up the distance. She wondered if he was looking for the trapper, but the street appeared empty in the gathering dusk. "Who was that man, Mrs.?" Coulter appeared at Adelaide's elbow, her eyes bright with curiosity. The landlady was a widow of 50 years, kind-hearted but prone to gossip. "A customer from the store," Adelaide replied, trying to keep her voice light. "He was kind enough to walk me home, Mrs." Coulter made a humming sound that suggested she did not quite believe the casual explanation, but she let it pass. "Supper is on the table. Do not let it get cold." That night, Adelaide lay in her narrow bed in the room she shared with 2 other boarders, both already asleep and snoring softly. She found herself thinking not about the trapper who had haunted her steps for weeks, but about storm-gray eyes and shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of mountains. She told herself it was merely gratitude, merely relief at finding an ally. But when she finally drifted to sleep, her dreams were filled with a voice like distant thunder and hands gentle, despite their strength. True to his word, Tobias Kane stood outside the general store at precisely 6 o'clock the following evening. Adelaide spotted him through the window as she helped Mr. Peterson tally the day's receipts, and her heart performed an unexpected leap. He leaned against the post that supported the store's awning, looking perfectly relaxed, but his eyes scanned the street with the alertness of a predator. "Your mountain man is here," Mr. Peterson observed, peering over his spectacles. "He is not my mountain man," Adelaide protested, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. Mr. Peterson chuckled. "Whatever you say, Miss Graham. Though I will note that Tobias Kane is a good man. despite his rough appearance. He has been trapping and hunting these mountains for near on 8 years, and he has never once caused trouble in my store or anywhere else in town. Keeps to himself mostly, but honorable. Adelaide absorbed this information as she removed her apron and collected her shawl. You know where he lives? Somewhere up in the high country, I believe. He comes down every few weeks for supplies, sells his furs to the trading post, then disappears back into the wilderness. Lonely life, I would imagine, but some men are built for solitude. Adelaide thanked Mr. Peterson and stepped outside. The evening air carried the first real chill of autumn, and she was glad for her shawl. Tobias straightened when he saw her, removing his hat in that same formal gesture from the previous evening. "Miss Adelaide," he greeted her. "Tobias," she replied, and was rewarded with that small smile that transformed his rugged features. He offered his arm, and they began the walk toward Mrs. Coulter's boarding house. Adelaide found herself hyper-aware of everything, the strength of his arm beneath her hand, the way he automatically positioned himself between her and the street, the subtle scent of pine and wood smoke that clung to his clothes. "Did you have trouble today?" he asked. Adelaide shook her head. "I did not see the trapper at all. Perhaps he has lost interest." Tobias made a non-committal sound. "Perhaps, or perhaps he is being cautious." They walked in companionable silence for a while. Adelaide noticed the same curious glances from townsfolk, saw Mrs. Henderson whisper to Mrs. Walsh behind her hand, but she lifted her chin and ignored them. Let them talk. She had done nothing wrong, and she would not apologize for accepting help when she needed it. "Tell me about your trapping," Adelaide said, suddenly curious about this man who had appeared in her life like some protective spirit. "Is it very difficult work?" Tobias considered the question. "It can be. The winters are harsh in the high country and the work is solitary. But there is a freedom to it that I have never found anywhere else. The mountains do not care about a man's past or his mistakes. They judge him only by his ability to survive them." There was something in his tone, some hint of old pain, that made Adelaide look up at him more closely. "Is that why you chose this life? To escape something?" He met her eyes, and for a moment she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "I came west after the war. I had seen enough of death and destruction, enough of what men do to each other when given orders and rifles. The mountains offered peace, or at least the chance to live by my own code rather than someone else's." Adelaide felt a surge of sympathy. She had been just a child during the war between the states, but she remembered the soldiers returning to St. Louis, their eyes haunted by things they could not speak about. "You fought for the Union, yes, 4 years that felt like 40. He paused, then seemed to shake off the dark memories. "But that was long ago. Tell me about you, Adelaide Graham. What brings a proper young lady to a rough town like Montana City?" Adelaide laughed, though there was little humor in it. "I am not so proper as all that, I am afraid. My father died owing more money than we could ever repay, and my mother followed him to the grave within a year. I had relatives in St. Louis who might have taken me in, but they would have expected me to marry whomever they chose, likely some elderly merchant in need of a young wife to manage his household. I decided I would rather choose my own fate, even if it meant coming to the frontier." "That took courage," Tobias said, and Adelaide heard genuine respect in his voice. "Or foolishness. I am not always certain which." They had reached the boarding house, and Adelaide realized with surprise that she wished the walk were longer. She released Tobias's arm reluctantly. "Will you be in town tomorrow?" she asked, trying to keep her voice casual. "I can be," Tobias replied, "if you need me to be." Adelaide looked up at him, at this mountain of a man who had appointed himself her guardian without asking for anything in return. "The trapper may not be gone." If you could spare the time, I would feel safer with your company. Then I will be here at 6 o'clock, Tobias said. He hesitated, then added, "It is no hardship, Adelaide. I find myself enjoying the conversation." She smiled, feeling warmth spread through her chest. "As do I." That night, Mrs. Coulter was more direct in her questioning. "That is the same man as yesterday. Adelaide, people are beginning to talk." Adelaide set down her teacup with perhaps more force than necessary. "Let them talk. That man has shown me more kindness and protection than anyone else in this town, and I will not apologize for accepting his help." Mrs. Coulter's expression softened. "I am not scolding you, child, but I would know the full story. Are you in some kind of trouble?" Adelaide explained about the trapper, about the weeks of fear, about the sheriff's indifference. Mrs. Coulter's face grew stern as she listened. "That is unacceptable," the landlady declared. "Sheriff Dawson should be ashamed of himself. And if Tobias Kane is willing to see you safely home, then I say let him. Better to have people gossip about your walking companion than to have you come to harm." The pattern continued for the next week. Each evening at 6 o'clock, Tobias waited outside the general store, and each evening they walked together to the boarding house. Adelaide found herself looking forward to these walks more than was probably wise. Tobias proved to be an excellent listener and a thoughtful conversationalist. He told her about the mountains, about tracking elk through fresh snow, about the crystal clarity of high alpine lakes. She told him about her dreams of perhaps one day opening her own shop, about the books she loved to read, about small memories of her parents that she treasured. The trapper appeared twice more, always keeping his distance, always watching. But he never approached while Tobias walked beside Adelaide, and she began to feel that perhaps the worst was over. On the 8th evening, Tobias arrived at the store with a small package wrapped in brown paper. "I brought you something," he said, almost shyly. Adelaide unwrapped it to find a beautifully carved wooden box, its lid decorated with an intricate pattern of pine trees and mountains. "Tobias, this is lovely. Did you make it?" "The nights are long in the high country," he said. "A man needs something to occupy his hands." Adelaide ran her fingers over the smooth wood, marveling at the craftsmanship. "Thank you, I will treasure it." As they walked, Adelaide felt emboldened by the gift. "Tobias, may I ask you something perhaps too personal?" "You may ask me anything." "Why are you doing this? Truly? You could be back in your mountains, living the solitary life you chose, but instead you are here every evening, walking a shopgirl home." Tobias was quiet for so long that Adelaide feared she had overstepped. Then he said, "At first, it was simply because I saw someone in need of help and I had the ability to provide it. But I would be lying if I said that was still the only reason." He stopped walking and turned to face her fully. "Adelaide, these past 8 days have been the finest I have known in years. Your company has reminded me that solitude, while peaceful, is not the same as contentment. I find myself thinking about our evening walks throughout the day. I find myself inventing excuses to stay in town rather than return to my cabin." Adelaide's heart was pounding so hard she was certain he must hear it. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that my feelings have grown beyond simple protection. I am saying that I have come to care for you deeply, and I hope that perhaps you might feel something similar." He paused, his expression uncertain in a way she had never seen before. "But I am also aware that I have little to offer. I am a rough man who lives a rough life. You deserve fine things, civilization, security. I have no right to ask you to consider anything more than friendship." Adelaide reached up and placed her hand against his bearded cheek, feeling the warmth of his skin, the slight scratch of his beard. "Tobias Kane, do you truly not see that you have offered me more in these 8 days than anyone has in years? You have offered me safety, companionship, respect, and genuine care. Those are worth more than all the fine things in the world." His hand came up to cover hers, and Adelaide felt the calluses on his palm, the strength in his fingers. "Adelaide, I have not courted a woman in more years than I care to count. I do not know the pretty words or proper manners. But I know that when I am with you, I feel like I have found something I did not even know I was searching for." "Then perhaps we are both finding something," Adelaide whispered. Tobias bent his head slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished. But Adelaide rose on her toes to meet him, and when his lips touched hers, gentle despite his size and strength, she felt as though everything in her life had been leading to this moment. The kiss was sweet and careful, full of promise and possibility. When they finally drew apart, Tobias rested his forehead against hers. "I would like to court you properly if you will have me." "I would like that very much," Adelaide replied. They stood there for a long moment, neither wanting to break the spell. Then Tobias stepped back, though he kept hold of her hand. "I should get you home before Mrs. Coulter sends out a search party." Adelaide laughed, feeling lighter than air. They resumed walking, their fingers intertwined, and Adelaide knew that the gossips would have much to discuss tomorrow. But she found she did not care at all. Mrs. Coulter took one look at Adelaide's face when she entered the boarding house and broke into a knowing smile. "So that is how things stand, is it?" Adelaide could not stop her own smile. "Yes, I believe it is." Over the following weeks, Adelaide and Tobias fell into a new pattern. He came into town not just in the evenings but sometimes during the day, helping Mr. Peterson with heavy lifting or repairs in exchange for the chance to see Adelaide during her breaks. On Sundays, when the store was closed, they would walk along the creek that ran through town, or sit on the bench outside the church and talk for hours. Tobias told her more about his life before the mountains, about growing up on a farm in Ohio, about the brother he had lost in the war. Adelaide shared her own stories, and found that speaking of her parents brought less pain when she could share the memories with someone who truly listened. The trapper had not appeared in over 2 weeks, and Adelaide began to hope that he had truly given up. Sheriff Dawson stopped her one day outside the general store. "Miss Graham, I hear you have acquired yourself a bodyguard." Adelaide lifted her chin. "Mr. Kane has been kind enough to ensure my safety since the law seemed unable to do so." The sheriff had the grace to look uncomfortable. "Now, that is not entirely fair. I told you I could not arrest a man for simply walking down the street. And I told you I felt threatened. Tobias took me seriously when you did not." Sheriff Dawson sighed. "For what it is worth, I have not seen that trapper fellow in some time. I heard he headed north, up toward the Canadian territories. You should be safe now." Adelaide thanked him coolly and went on her way. She reported the conversation to Tobias that evening and saw the tension ease slightly from his shoulders. "That is good news," he said. "Though I confess I am selfishly glad to have the excuse to keep walking you home." Adelaide laughed. "You do not need an excuse, Tobias. I want you to walk me home. I want to spend time with you." "Good," he said, and pulled her close for a kiss that made her forget all about trappers and sheriffs and anything else beyond the feeling of being held in his strong arms. As autumn deepened into winter, Adelaide and Tobias's courtship grew stronger. He taught her to identify animal tracks in the snow, to read weather signs in the clouds, to appreciate the stark beauty of the Montana wilderness. She introduced him to her favorite books, reading aloud to him on quiet Sunday afternoons, and was delighted to discover that he had a sharp mind and loved learning despite his rough exterior. One snowy evening in late November, Tobias arrived at the store looking more serious than usual. Adelaide felt a flutter of concern as they began their walk home. "Is something wrong?" she asked. Tobias took a deep breath. "Adelaide, winter is settling in hard now. Soon the passes will be closed and I will need to return to my cabin in the high country. I have been putting it off, making excuses, but I cannot delay much longer." Adelaide felt her heart sink. She had known this moment would come, but she had not wanted to face it. "How long will you be gone?" The passes typically do not clear until April or May. It could be 5 months or more. He stopped walking and turned to face her. "Adelaide, I have been thinking. I do not want to be apart from you for that long. I do not want to be apart from you at all." "Neither do I," Adelaide said, her voice small. Tobias reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object. When he opened his hand, Adelaide saw a ring, simple but beautiful, made of carved wood inlaid with a delicate pattern of gold. "I made this for you. I know I should have a proper ring of silver or gold, and I will get you one when I can, but for now, this is what I have to offer." He dropped to one knee in the snow, heedless of the cold and wet. "Adelaide Graham, I love you with everything I am. I know I am not a sophisticated man and I cannot offer you the comforts of city life, but I can promise to spend every day trying to make you happy. Will you marry me?" Adelaide felt tears streaming down her face, hot against her cold cheeks. "Yes," she said, pulling him to his feet. "Yes, Tobias, I will marry you. I love you too so very much." He slipped the ring onto her finger and it fit perfectly. Then he kissed her, deep and passionate, and Adelaide felt the world fade away until there was nothing but the two of them and the softly falling snow. "I do not want to wait until spring," Adelaide said when they finally broke apart. "I do not want to spend months apart. Marry me now before winter closes in." Tobias looked stunned. "Are you certain?" "Adelaide, you would have to come to the mountains with me. My cabin is small and rough. The winter will be hard. You would be giving up your job, your room at Mrs. Coulter's, the little comforts you have built here." "I do not care about any of that," Adelaide said firmly. "I care about you. I care about building a life together. We can make your cabin into our home. We can face the winter together. As long as I am with you, I can face anything." Tobias crushed her to his chest, and Adelaide felt his heart pounding as hard as her own. "Then we will see the preacher tomorrow and marry as soon as he can arrange it." The wedding took place 3 days later in the small church in Montana City. Adelaide wore her best dress, a simple blue wool that brought out the color of her eyes. Tobias had purchased new clothes for the occasion, proper trousers and a white shirt, though he looked slightly uncomfortable in them. Mrs. Coulter attended as Adelaide's witness, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. Mr. Peterson stood up for Tobias, beaming throughout the brief ceremony. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Tobias kissed Adelaide with such tenderness that she felt her knees go weak. They were married. She was Adelaide Kane now, wife to a mountain man, about to embark on an adventure she could never have imagined 6 months ago. There was no time for a wedding trip or celebration. Winter was coming fast, and they needed to reach Tobias's cabin before the next storm hit. Adelaide packed her few belongings, said tearful goodbyes to Mrs. Coulter and the other boarders, and accepted Mr. Peterson's gift of extra supplies for their journey. Tobias had 2 horses waiting, sturdy mountain ponies capable of handling the rough terrain. He helped Adelaide mount one, then swung onto the other with practiced ease. They set out in the early morning, heading into the mountains as the sun painted the snow-covered peaks in shades of pink and gold. The journey took 2 days, climbing higher and higher into country so wild and beautiful it took Adelaide's breath away. They camped the first night in a small cave Tobias knew, and he built a fire to keep them warm. Adelaide snuggled against him beneath thick furs, feeling safe and content despite the strangeness of sleeping on the ground. "Are you regretting your choice yet?" Tobias asked, stroking her hair. Adelaide looked up at him, at the face she had come to love so deeply. "Not for a single moment. This is the greatest adventure of my life, and I am sharing it with you. How could I regret that?" He kissed her then, slow and deep, and the kiss led to other things as they claimed each other fully for the first time as husband and wife. Adelaide discovered that Tobias was as gentle and attentive in this as he was in everything else, and when they finally fell asleep in each other's arms, she had never felt more cherished. They reached the cabin late the following afternoon. It was indeed small and rough, a single room built of thick logs, with a stone fireplace and a few pieces of handmade furniture. But it was solid and well built, and Adelaide could see the care Tobias had put into every detail. "It is not much," Tobias said, sounding uncertain. Adelaide turned to him and smiled. "It is perfect. It is ours, and that makes it perfect." They spent the next week settling in and preparing for the deep winter. Tobias taught Adelaide how to preserve meat, how to bank the fire for maximum heat with minimum wood, how to read the signs that predicted incoming storms. Adelaide organized the cabin, adding small touches that transformed it from a bachelor's shelter into a real home. She sewed curtains from spare fabric, arranged wildflowers she had dried during the journey, created spaces for her books and Tobias's carving tools. The first major blizzard hit in mid-December, and for 3 days they were trapped inside while wind howled and snow piled high against the walls. But Adelaide found she did not mind. Tobias taught her to carve wood, and she taught him to read more complex texts. They talked for hours, made love by firelight, and built an intimacy deeper than Adelaide had known was possible. On Christmas Eve, Tobias presented her with a gift, a beautifully carved rocking chair, perfect in every detail. "For when we have children," he said softly, "I hope you do not mind that I am planning our future." Adelaide threw her arms around him. "I hope for children too. A family, a real family, built on love and choice rather than obligation." "You have given me that already," Tobias said. "You have given me a home and a purpose beyond mere survival. You have given me joy. And you have given me safety and love and adventure," Adelaide replied. "You have given me a life I never dreamed possible." The winter passed more quickly than Adelaide expected. There were hard days, certainly, when supplies ran low or illness struck, or the cabin fever grew oppressive. But there were far more good days, days of laughter and love, of learning and growing together. Adelaide discovered she was stronger than she had known, capable of handling the challenges of mountain living. Tobias discovered that sharing his life was infinitely better than the solitude he had chosen for so many years. Spring came slowly to the high country, but eventually the snow began to melt and the passes cleared. Tobias and Adelaide made the journey down to Montana City in late April, both eager to see familiar faces and stock up on supplies. The town greeted them with friendly curiosity. Mrs. Coulter hugged Adelaide fiercely, demanding to know every detail of her winter. Mr. Peterson congratulated Tobias and offered him the best prices on the furs he had brought to trade. Even Sheriff Dawson tipped his hat and offered stiff congratulations. As they walked through town together, Adelaide noticed something that made her stop short. A wanted poster on the wall of the sheriff's office, the face on it unmistakably that of the trapper who had followed her. Sheriff Dawson followed her gaze. "That fellow turned out to be wanted for assault in 3 territories. Attacked a woman up in Helena back in January. She fought him off and he got arrested. When we found out, I felt mighty bad about not taking your concerns more seriously, Miss Graham, Or I suppose it is Mrs. Kane now." Adelaide leaned against Tobias, grateful once again for his presence in her life. At least he has been caught. No other woman will have to suffer his attentions. They spent 3 days in town, visiting with friends and conducting business. On the third evening, as they prepared to return to their cabin, Adelaide told Tobias something she had been certain of for the past 2 weeks. "We are going to need that rocking chair sooner than expected," she said, watching his face carefully. It took him a moment to understand, and then his expression transformed into pure joy. "Truly, Adelaide, truly," she nodded, laughing as he picked her up and spun her around. "Truly. I believe the baby will come in late autumn." Tobias set her down gently as though she were made of glass. "We should stay in town. You should have a doctor nearby, proper care." "We will come down when the time grows close," Adelaide assured him. "But for now, I want to be home. I want to be in our cabin in our mountains." They returned to the high country, and summer unfolded in a golden haze. Adelaide's belly grew round, and Tobias became even more protective, though Adelaide insisted she was perfectly capable of most of her usual tasks. They prepared for the baby together, Tobias carving a beautiful cradle and Adelaide sewing tiny clothes from soft fabric she had purchased in town. In late September, they made the journey back to Montana City. Mrs. Coulter insisted Adelaide stay at the boarding house for the final weeks, and Tobias took a room at the hotel so he could be nearby. The waiting was hard for both of them, but Adelaide was grateful for Mrs. Coulter's experienced presence and the knowledge that the town doctor was just minutes away. The baby came on a cold October night, arriving with a lusty cry that announced his presence to the world. Tobias was allowed into the room shortly after, and Adelaide would never forget the look on his face when he held his son for the first time. "He is perfect," Tobias whispered, tears streaming down his face. "Adelaide, he is perfect." They named him Thomas after Tobias's brother who had died in the war. Thomas Kane had his father's dark hair and his mother's blue eyes, and from the first moment, Adelaide could see that Tobias was completely devoted to his son. They remained in town through the worst of the winter, both wanting to ensure Thomas was strong enough for mountain living before making the journey. It was hard being away from their cabin, but they made the most of it. Tobias found work helping around town, and Adelaide enjoyed introducing her son to the people who had become like family. When spring arrived, they finally returned to their mountain home. Thomas was 6 months old, healthy and thriving, and the journey was easier than Adelaide had feared. The cabin welcomed them back, and Adelaide felt her heart swell with contentment as she stepped through the door. "Home," she said simply, and Tobias kissed her temple. "Home," he agreed. The years that followed were full and rich. Thomas grew into a sturdy boy with his father's strength and his mother's quick mind. When he was 3, Adelaide gave birth to a daughter they named Anne, who had her father's gray eyes and a fierce independence that amused and challenged them both. 2 years later, another son arrived, Matthew, who was gentle and thoughtful from the start. Tobias proved to be a wonderful father, patient and loving, teaching his children the ways of the mountains while Adelaide ensured they learned their letters and numbers. They made trips to Montana City several times a year, maintaining friendships and conducting business, but their true home remained the cabin in the high country. Adelaide sometimes thought back to that frightened young woman who had walked home in fear, to the moment when Tobias had stepped into her path and changed everything. She thought about how close she had come to missing this life, this love, this family. But fate, or providence, or simple luck had brought them together, and she was grateful every single day. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Tobias surprised her with another gift, a silver ring to replace the wooden one he had given her during his proposal. "I promised you a proper ring," he said. Adelaide looked at the silver band, beautiful and expensive, clearly purchased during his last trip to town. Then she looked at the wooden ring she still wore on her right hand, the one she had moved when Tobias had placed a simple gold wedding band on her left finger. "I love the silver ring," she said, "but the wooden one will always be my favorite. It represents everything we have built together, everything we have overcome. It represents the moment you asked me to share your life, rough edges and all." Tobias pulled her close. "I would do it all again, every moment. You are my greatest adventure, Adelaide Kane." "And you are mine," she whispered back. They stood together on the porch of their cabin, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of purple and gold. Inside, they could hear their children laughing as they played some imaginary game. The sound of their joy was the sweetest music Adelaide had ever known. Life in the mountains was never easy. There were hard winters and lean times, illnesses that frightened them and storms that tested their strength. But through it all, they had each other. Adelaide had found in Tobias not just a protector, but a true partner, someone who valued her strength as much as he offered his own. Tobias had found in Adelaide not just a wife, but a companion who made even the hardest days bearable through her courage and love. As the children grew older, they sometimes asked their parents about how they had met. Adelaide and Tobias would exchange glances, and Tobias would begin the story. "Your mother was being followed by a bad man," he would say, "and I decided I would walk her home to keep her safe." "And then what happened?" the children would ask, even though they had heard the story many times. "Then we fell in love," Adelaide would finish. "And we built a life together in these mountains, and that life brought us to you." The children would be satisfied with this, as children always are with stories that end in love and family. They did not need to know all the details, all the fear and uncertainty that had marked those early days. They only needed to know that their parents loved each other and loved them, and that was enough. When Thomas was 15, he asked his father why they lived so far from civilization, why they did not move to town where life would be easier. Tobias took his son on a long walk through the mountains, showing him the pristine lakes and towering peaks, the valleys where elk grazed and eagles soared. "This is our heritage," Tobias said. "This land has given us freedom and peace. It has taught us to rely on ourselves and each other. When you are grown, you can choose your own path. You can move to town or even to a city if you wish. But I hope you will carry these mountains in your heart always, and remember that sometimes the hardest paths lead to the greatest rewards." Thomas did eventually move to Montana City when he was grown, becoming a successful merchant. But he brought his wife and children to visit often, and he taught them to love the mountains as his father had taught him. Anne chose to stay in the high country, marrying a fur trader and building her own cabin not far from her parents. Matthew became a doctor, studying in the East but returning to Montana Territory to serve the scattered communities that needed medical care. Adelaide and Tobias watched their children grow and thrive with deep satisfaction. They had given them roots and wings, stability and freedom, and all three had become fine adults who contributed to the world in their own ways. As they aged, Tobias's hair turned silver and Adelaide's face gained lines from years of laughter and sun. But Tobias still looked at Adelaide with the same wonder he had felt that first evening when he had offered to walk her home. And Adelaide still felt her heart skip when Tobias smiled at her in that particular way that was hers alone. On a summer evening in their 30th year of marriage, they sat together on the porch, watching the sunset much as they had done thousands of times before. Their children were all living their own lives now, though they visited often and brought grandchildren that filled the cabin with noise and joy during their stays. "You ever regret it?" Tobias asked suddenly. "Giving up the chance for an easier life?" Adelaide took his weathered hand in hers. "Not once. Not ever. You gave me everything I needed, Tobias. You gave me safety when I was afraid, love when I was lonely, and a family when I thought I would always be alone. You gave me adventure and purpose and joy. How could I possibly regret any of that?" "I was so afraid that first evening," Tobias admitted. "Afraid I was overstepping, afraid you would think me too forward, but I could not walk past and do nothing. You looked so frightened, and something in me needed to help. And something in me recognized that you were safe, even though you were a stranger," Adelaide said. "I think our souls knew each other before our minds did." Tobias lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Adelaide Kane. You took a lonely mountain man and taught him what it means to truly live. And you took a frightened shop girl and showed her she was strong enough to face anything," Adelaide replied. They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear, one by one, in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, and another answered. The sound that had once frightened Adelaide now comforted her, a reminder of the wild beauty of the mountains she called home. Inside the cabin, the rocking chair Tobias had made still sat by the fireplace, its wood worn smooth from years of use. The carved box he had given her during their courtship held her most precious possessions. Letters from their children, pressed wildflowers from special occasions, the wooden engagement ring she had never been able to discard. These were the treasures of a life well lived, a life built on love and trust and mutual respect. As the moon rose over the mountains, casting silver light across the landscape, Adelaide thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. She thought about the trapper who had unknowingly set in motion a chain of events that led to everything she held dear. She thought about the courage it had taken to accept help from a stranger, to open her heart to love, to choose adventure over safety. But mostly she thought about Tobias, about the man who had appeared in her life like an answer to a prayer she had not known she was praying. He had walked her home night after night until she felt safe again, and in doing so, he had walked straight into her heart and made a home there too. "I love you," she said softly, the words as true now as they had been when she first spoke them in the snow all those years ago. "I love you too," Tobias replied, pulling her closer. "Today, tomorrow, and always." They remained on the porch long into the night, two souls who had found each other against all odds, two hearts that beat as one. The mountains stood eternal around them, witnesses to their love story, guardians of the life they had built together. And in the quiet peace of that moment, surrounded by the wild beauty of the Montana high country, Adelaide Kane knew that she had found exactly what she had been searching for when she fled St. Louis all those years ago. She had found home. She had found love. She had found herself. And it had all begun with a mountain man who had been brave enough to step into her path and kind enough to walk her home.